Such an honour to be here. I have read Noble Fragments twice. I think I need to read it 3 or 4 times to be able to digest. It's just got so much content in there. So we were discussing where do we start. We had about 20 threads we could start with. And I thought, let's take it out of the book and talk about your recent trip to New York and how you were fated when you got there.
But thank you, everybody, for coming. It's great to see so many people here. So a little bit cart before the horse. I was lucky enough this year to be able to go to New York and Boston and Philadelphia to give some talks about the book, which was very heartwarming for me to get that recognition because a lot of the book is set in America. And so I was able to speak at the New York Public Library, who have a Gutenberg Bible, which is central to my book. And also to go to the New York Red Book Fair, where I was able to meet the book dealers who I had spoken to in the research for the book, and also to the University of Pennsylvania, where I had a very nice experience. After going to a show in New York at the beginning of our trip, my wife and I were going in the subway down to get an ice cream, and we bumped into a couple of nice young women who asked us why we were there. I sort of undenied. My wife sort of gave them the story about what I was doing, giving talks, and that I was going to Philadelphia. And they said, "Oh, that's nice. You know, one of them lived there," and she wished me good luck. And then when I went to give the talk at the University of Pennsylvania, I was just about to start, and this woman came up, and I vaguely remembered her, and she said, "Hello, it's Erin from the subway." So that made me feel that the trip was very special.
And that's the sort of coincidental of events that happen throughout the book. That just sort of gives you a little bit of an entree into the book, the research, and all of those loose threads that come together throughout. So tell us a bit about how you started this whole forensic investigation into Noble Fragments.
Well, at the heart of the book was me wanting to find out a little bit about one of my grandfather's wives. So my grandfather, whose name was Michael Visontay, if you're Hungarian, he had 3 wives, and we knew a lot about the first wife, and I'd grown up with the 3rd wife, but the 2nd wife, whose name was Olga, had been virtually erased from the family history. I didn't know hardly anything about her. I didn't know where she was buried. I haven't seen a photo about her. Her name, whenever it was raised, was sort of then hushed away as a taboo. And so about 5 years ago, when my mother passed away shortly before COVID, and my father had died about 10 years earlier, which meant that it was time to have a reckoning with family documents and all of the historical information about the family. I was in lockdown, so I had plenty of time on my hands, and I started going through some strong boxes that my father had scoured away. And inside one of them, there was a whole treasure trove of documents. So I was looking for tidbits, morsels of information about Olga, of whom I knew very little. But in a way, I should say before going on that my book owes a lot to the fact that my father was something between a hoarder and an archivist, depending on which paper you asked me. And he kept all this remarkable information in these strong boxes. So just to give you an idea, he had the receipt from the Rolls Royces that he rented for their wedding at the Great Synagogue in Sydney, the receipt from the motel that they went to stay on at their honeymoon up at Surfers Paradise. Some of you may know it, the El Dorado. A psychological assessment of my father just after the war, when he was at school and was struggling, having come back from Auschwitz. And then also a sort of a medical document just on the eve of him coming to Australia, which attested to his weight, his height, and his physical characteristics. And I noted that it said he was 6'1", and I'd only ever known he was 5'7". And I tried not to think about what that meant for me. Anyway, so huge treasure trove of information in there, and I was looking for information about Olga, the second wife. And there was this legal document on sort of parched paper with these red legal stamps on it. And it seemed to be a challenge to my grandfather, Polly's legal situation. And I hadn't seen it. I didn't know anything about it. And Olga's name was on there, but so too was the name of the sort of source of this legal challenge. It's a man called Gabriel Wells in New York. The name meant nothing to me. And so, wanting to find out information about Olga, I then realized that I had to find out more about this man, Gabriel Wells, to make sense of what this connection was and then what this legal challenge was. And so I Googled his name and saw that he'd had a very prominent obituary in the New York Times, which said he had been a prominent rare book dealer in New York in the first half of the 20th century, particularly in the Gilded Age in the 1910s and 20s, where the Gatsby era, when there was a lot of money around and people were splashing their fortunes on art and books and so on. But that his main claim to fame was that he had bought a Gutenberg Bible about 100 years ago in 1921, and the Gutenberg Bible was the holy grail of rare books because it was the first substantial book printed with a printing press, a movable metal type in Western Europe. And this was considered an act of literary vandalism. He bought the book and he had broken it up and sold it off in individual leaves. A leaf is two sides of a page. And the Book of Esther or the Book of Revelation, if it was intact. And he called them Noble Fragments, which was a fancy title for what he was doing, hence the name of my book. And this had made him famous, also infamous. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to sort of know more about, well, who was this man? You know, and how did he come to be somehow linked to this challenge to my family?
And he ended up being Olga's uncle. And so Gabriel had actually gone from Hungary to New York, or to Boston originally.
That's right.
Because he was running away from a marriage.
Well, not exactly. So he was a very colourful man who the more I learned about him, the more I realised that he was a very good innovator. He liked to think sideways, sometimes bent, not necessarily the law, but what was ethical. So he was born in the 1860s in a small town near Budapest, and he was born Gabriel Weiss, the eldest of 10 children to a prosperous Jewish wool merchant in the town. Very smart, learned 8 languages as a young man, and was expected to take over the family business when his parents retired. But he couldn't really wait for that, so he got himself involved in a lot of interesting sort of business deals. Also got married very young. But then one of his business deals went bad, and he was in debt. And he decided that the best way to extricate himself from that would be to emigrate to America. So most of the Eastern European Jews who emigrated in the 1890s were going because they were poor, they had nothing, and they wanted a better life. Gabriel was not poor, he had something, but he lost it. Mm-hmm. And he didn't want to face the music, so he escaped and somehow forgot to tell his wife. But that made it a bit easier to get out.
She granted him a divorce in absentia.
She granted him a divorce in absentia, yeah.
And he established himself in a foreign land, and the only language he didn't speak was English.
Yes. So, you know, he wasn't really strategic, but he had a lot of ideas, yeah. So he got to Boston, fell into the circle of William James, who was the head of psychology there, is considered the father of modern psychology, and he's the brother of Henry James, the novelist. And so he sort of took Gabriel Wells under his wing. Gabriel tutored in German and French to sort of get himself on his feet. And then when he felt secure, he went down to New York, where he started getting involved in the world of rare books. And he started off by collecting these lectures that were given by a travel writer who would have these sellout lectures every week from New York with a magic lantern show, which was sort of the precursor of a slideshow. And the lectures would be printed and bound and then sold in subscription. So Gabriel Wells had the idea of rebinding them and putting them together as a book and then selling them. And he called himself a reviser which was a profession until that point unheard of. And I don't think it's been heard of again. And there were a few times when he would invent words like that.
That's right. There's a lot of words in the book that I hadn't heard of, and revisor was one of them.
Yeah.
So he was very entrepreneurial, but he was considered a B grade.
Yes, he was struggling because there were a lot of really very well-established rare book dealers who had as their major clients the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the DuPonts, the Huntingtons, because this was the 1910s and then later the 1920s when these people had discovered gold, oil, started the railways. There was the invention of electricity, phonograph, and so there were huge fortunes made. And these rich collectors these rich tycoons wanted to prove that they were refined as well as rich, so that they had some respectability. And the way they did that was to buy art and then to create libraries. But of course, they didn't know what made an interesting or important book, so they would get book dealers to be their curators, to be their cultural advisors. And the really good ones had the rich collectors, and they made a fortune. And then underneath them, there were people like Gabriel Wells who was struggling. Ironically, the event that got his name better known didn't happen in New York, it happened in London. So every year, book dealers would go to London because that was the centre of the rare book world, because all of the landed gentry there had huge libraries that had been accrued over hundreds of years, and the dealers would go over and talk to them, see who was about to die, see what...
And wasn't it when they introduced the death tax?
Yes.
In the UK.
That's right.
And the landed gentry that had collected these wonderful rare books decided we have to get rid of our, everything that's really valuable to monetize it so that we don't have to hand it down to our descendants and they'd be paying awful amounts of tax.
Yes, so it got a bit ugly, I guess, in the way now that young people want their parents to give them a living will to help them buy a mortgage, because rather get the book sold, before daddy died, and that way there's no tax. So every year the dealers would go over, and Gabriel's was one of them. And I think in 2014 there was a dealer over in London who came up with a really ambitious project. So there was a very famous book called The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which was the thoughts and philosophies of the 14th century Persian philosopher and mathematician Omar Khayyam. And so this publisher in England decided to have it translated. The translation was nothing special, but he thought it's a very exotic book, and so we're going to give it a fancy name, The Great Omar, and we're going to have it bound up very lavishly because then it'll become a real collector's item. And so they commissioned a bookbinder to bind it, covered with 1,000 rare jewels, topaz, ruby, emeralds. So it was incredible. 9 square metres of gold leaf. So it was considered to be the most stunning book ever bound. But because of the money he'd invested and because he was a little bit greedy, he asked for too much of a price. And so nobody was biting. He went to Gabriel Wells. Wells said no. And then finally, when it came down to half the price, he said, well, okay, I'll take it off your hands. But he was a bit worried about how he was going to get it back to New York. He didn't want it to go unaccompanied because it might go astray, or it might be given a huge customs duty when it arrived. So he decided that he would get a courier. And so he arranged through a friend to get a courier to take it back on a ship. But the courier was not very reliable and missed the ship. And so the next day he turned up and he took the next ship, and that ship was the Titanic. And so the courier and his book and a whole lot of other very wealthy people went to the bottom of the ocean, and nothing was ever heard of again from the book. And Gabriel Wells was then given a reputation as being unlucky, cursed, but also somebody who liked to take risks, somebody who was a little bit different. And so his name spread, and in a sense that grew his reputation. And that was the sort of basis for how he then came upon the idea of buying a Gutenberg Bible.
So how did he acquire the Gutenberg Bible?
Well, one of his collector friends from New York, who would go over to London scouting around for the same things, sent him a message. I I think it was in 1920, had said, look, I've heard about a Bible, a Gutenberg Bible, which at that time were being sold for 50,000 American dollars, which is an astronomical amount of money. I've heard about one that's going under the radar. Sotheby's are going to auction it. But it's going to be right down the list, and I think it's going to go cheap. And the reason for that was, there were three reasons, actually. The first was that it was missing 53 leaves, about 100 pages, but I mean 1,280 pages in a Gutenberg Bible. It's so big that it's actually in 2 volumes. So it meant that it was not perfect, but 53 out of 643 wasn't such a flaw, but it did lower the price.
It also had some of the introductory letters missing.
Yes, so that was interesting. So a lot of the pages in the Bible were damaged. So you'll see in antiquated books that they have these big, colourful letters. They're called rubrications, where they get an illustrator in to make them look fancy. And this was missing a few. And because the woman who had inherited it, Baroness Curzon Franklin, from the Curzon family, because she'd inherited it from uncles and cousins, she didn't really value it much, so she sort of left it out. And the scholars think that her children were bored one afternoon and saw the book and started cutting them out. So that was another reason why it wasn't right at the top of the list. And then the third thing was that the book had been in the one family for 150 years, which meant that it hadn't been sold publicly, and it meant that auctioneers and scholars hadn't been able to verify that it was actually the copy of the Gutenberg Bible that it was supposed to be. So for all those reasons, it was number 70 on the list, sold at 8 o'clock in the evening, not the trophy item. And Wells got it from Metzia, 20% of the normal price. And then he turned around and said, well, I bought this book and this Bible, and it's missing 100 pages, and that's just too many for me to try and sell it intact. It was a very chutzpah, because that was one of the reasons he wanted it, and now he's saying nobody else had wanted it. So he came up with this plan that he was going to break it up into individual pages, the Sermon on the Mount, the Ten Commandments, or books if they were intact, the book of Genesis, the book of Esther. And then he would sell it off to the rich collectors and also some institutions.
Yeah. So there were Harvard, there was a number of institutions that benefited because of his philanthropy as much as anything, or some of them, obviously he made a lot of money. That was part of the process.
I mean, he was driven essentially as a merchant to make money. He was a bookseller. But he also was publicly minded. Some people have said it was a PR stunt, and I'm not really sure. But, for example, the New York Public Library had the first Gutenberg Bible, and there were only 45 known at the time. There were 180 that were printed in Germany, and only 45 left from 1455 up to that point. So the New York Public Library had imported the very first one into America, but it was missing 4 leaves, the first 4 pages of the book. And Gabriel Wells's Bible happened to have 3 of them. So in a very public display, he gave 3 of his leaves to the New York Public Library. And some people thought, well, he's just trying to make himself look a bit better. Really, he's only in this for the money. But on the other hand, he did gift leaves of the Bible to Harvard, to Yale, and to a whole lot of other institutions, including in Hungary. So the literary world was divided. You know.
Is it vandalism or is it an act of chivalry? And he referred to it as the democratization of knowledge.
Yes, so that's something I'd like you to ponder. Is it a crime to take the world's greatest book, of which there are only 45, the first book that was printed on a printing press and was the gateway to democratizing knowledge, because from the printing press sprung mass literacy, education for children, universities, book publishing, media, and all the way up to the internet. Is it a crime to take one of only 45 books and break it up? Or is it a misdemeanor because you are spreading that amongst so many more people than would have had access to it before? So the jury was out, but the wealthy collectors voted with their feet. They lined up to get the trophy pages, especially from the Old Testament. So DuPont, Carnegie, Jerome Kern, the composer, who had a big library, they all lined up. And so these leaves sold like hotcakes. And this made Gabriel Wells a lot of money, really cemented his reputation, because he was in the best traditions of Jewish merchant practice. He was selling retail. So, to give you an example, when an agent or a dealer would buy a rare book for a client, they would get a fee. They'd get 10%. And so they get 10% of $50,000, which was $5,000, and they kept that. But Gabriel Wells was selling each leaf retail, $150 for a perfect leaf, $100 if it had a few tears or holes. And so he kept the whole amount. So the papers were reporting that he made more by breaking up a book than others made by selling it intact. So it was quite canny.
And I mean, some of the dealers held on to their really important product, acquisitions, but he actually said, you cannot sell a book when you know too much about it. Let other dealers catalogue their books. I'll sell mine.
Yes.
So that was one of his sort of mottos.
Yes, he was. I think it showed that he was a no-nonsense sort of a person.
Yeah.
So in those days, I guess your stature, and these days, your stature as a dealer is measured by your catalogue, how you curated your wares, how you valued them, what information you have about where they come from. But he couldn't be bothered with that because he thought if you get an attachment to a hook, then you can't let go of it. And I think a lot of us know that. Personal experience. So he said, in and out, in and out.
Yeah. And meanwhile, this was sort of happening in America. There was this immense wealth, but in Europe, it was a whole other story that was starting to happen, where your family and his family were caught up in Hungary in the Holocaust towards the end of the war.
Yes.
Hungary had sort of, managed to get through up until about 1943, 1944.
44, yeah. So, yes, while Gabriel Wells was making his fortune right up into the war, over in Hungary, where his brothers and sisters and their children were living, they were stuck there. And also in provincial Hungary, in a small town called Gyöngyös, my family, so that was Polly, my grandfather, my grandmother Sarah, and my father Ivan, were living, they were not unaffected by the war, but really the war didn't come until late to Hungary until 1944, because at that point the Hungarian government had been supporting Hitler. They thought that he would help them get back what they had lost after the Treaty of Versailles. And then after the Battle of Stalingrad, they saw that Hitler was going to lose, and so they broke with him, and Hitler was furious, and so the Nazis invaded Hungary at the beginning of 44. And I know that probably for a lot of people in this room, that was almost, an afterthought compared to what had been experienced in Poland and in France and in Czechoslovakia. So my family were in this small town, Gyöngyös, where they ran a delicatessen, the most prominent delicatessen in the town. And like many Hungarian Jews, they were there till the beginning of 44, until the Nazis came in, and then there was a mass deportation of the provincial Jews in the smaller towns, into local ghettos, and then onto the concentration camps. Most of them, the majority, went to Auschwitz. So my grandfather, Polly, was sent away to a labour camp first, and he went to Mauthausen. And then my father, Ivan, who was only 14, and his mother, Sarah, were sent to Auschwitz, along with some cousins and other extended family.
In fact, there were I think there was Otto, his cousin, that was the same age, and another very close friend, another Otto.
Yes, so there's some couple of Ottos.
Three young boys that all managed to survive.
Yes.
I know there's this very, very tragic moment that involves Sarah, his mother. Can you tell us that? I know it's...
Yes, so I'm sure this part of this is quite familiar to people in the room, but when Ivan and Sarah arrived at Auschwitz, there was a selection. And Ivan was 14, was very chubby, ate well, and so had a lot of meat on him. And I think that actually helped him because he got sent one way with his cousin, and they were going to be forced labour. Ivan's mother, Sarah, was a robust and very healthy woman, quite tall, but she was supporting a cousin who had a withered leg and was walking with a caliper. And so because they were together, when the selection was made, Ivan was sent this way, and then Sarah was seen to be, well, not invalided, but associated with the invalid, and was sent off with the cousin who had the caliper. And unfortunately, they were sent off to the gas chamber, and so...
within a couple of days, Ivan was chosen to be one of the people that had to take the belongings away from the people who had perished.
Yes, they sent the young boys to be doing that, and it was a very tragic scene for him because he saw his mother's body under a pile of bodies then, which was something that he really couldn't talk about until many, many years later. The story that we'd grown up with when we actually heard the story was that his mother had gone one way, he'd never seen her again, and it was only later in life that he was able to verbalise the fact that he'd seen her corpse there under a mound of bodies. So that was
and that happens
trauma.
quite early on in the book, and that just gives you an introduction. I know it's giving away something, but it's just an indication of one of the many tragic and so poignant that all the way through these stories are just interwoven alongside the Gabriel Wells story in America. There's this backstory or front story. They're all equal, in the book. But what was also amazing is that Ivan, who became terribly ill in Auschwitz and ended up there were a few amazing miracles that happened. Tell us about the chapter called The Angel of Life.
Yes, so in Auschwitz, my father was subject to a selection with Dr. Mengele, the Angel of Death, who judged that he had enough meat on him that he should be fit to live. But very soon afterwards, my father got very ill. He was only 14, and he got scurvy, and all his teeth were rattling around, and body was covered in pus, and he had terrible, terrible infections, and he looked like he was going to die. But a non-Jewish doctor, a Czech man, took a shine to him, in the best possible way, and looked after him and got food scraps for him and strong medicine for him, and basically helped him survive the camp. And my father was indebted to him. They met up after the war, and in fact, it was because of this doctor's courage that later in life, my father became a member of an organisation called Courage to Care, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, where he could tell the story of how this doctor had intervened and risked his own life to save my father's life, and that was a lesson that he wanted to pass on to young children about the importance of being an upstander, not being a bystander.
Yeah, and my mother worked for Courage to Care as a facilitator because she was Australian-born, so wasn't a Holocaust survivor, but that brings us together.
Yeah.
And so when I read about the Sydney element, because it's so much of it is about, okay, let's go back to when Olga and Pali came together. So Pali lived, got back to the village.
Yes, he came back to the town before my father, and amazingly the delicatessen was intact and he was able to reopen it. My father came back a little bit later by himself. It took his father a full 3 days before he could bring himself to ask what had happened to his wife. After that, there was this very close bond between father and son.
Can I just take you back to another little episode that I found so intriguing? So when Ivan finds out that Pali's alive, he sends a telegram, and he sends it just saying Weizmann at the time was the name,
yes,
and the name of the town,
yes.
Thinking, well, that's the only family Weizmann there. And then he gets on the train and he expects that Pali will be there to meet him. Pali's not there.
Yeah.
The telegram's gone to Fleischmann.
Yeah.
Who never told Pali, Weizmann, who we would have known.
Absolutely.
That his son was coming.
Yes, I always struggled to make sense of that. So
so at that point,
that
these are the things that I find interesting. I know I don't want to tell your story for you, but...
Go ahead.
but the idea of the Weissman, and that's when the father and son are united, and they decided, let's change our name to something that no one's ever going to get confused with anything else. That's how Visontay became
That's
a
right.
name.
Yes. So they were Weissman, which was a common name, and the telegram actually went to a family called Watzmann. So it's W-A, this sort of similar beginning, which means from the town of Visontay, as Da Vinci means from Vinci. And it is true that in Australia we are the only Visontays, so that worked. There are a few in Canada who occasionally turn up on my Instagram feed.
Interesting.
So that was a really sort of big turning point as well.
Father and son are reunited, but they don't have a home to
No,
live.
their home had been was unlivable, so they were working. They cast around for somewhere to live, and they heard about a woman in the town who had a house, and she was renting rooms out from it. And this woman, she had been married. Her husband they were also Jewish, and he had been deported to Auschwitz. She had survived by escaping in the woods, and so all she had left in her life before the war, because they didn't have any children, was the family house, and so she was renting rooms out. So Polly and Ivan took a room in this woman's house, and her name was Olga Ilovsky. And so Olga was the niece of Gabriel Wells, one of 4 or 5 nieces and nephews. After about 9 or 10 months, my grandfather took my father aside and said, look, business is going well, but I'm a bit lonely and I'm going to marry Olga. So this was a bit of a shock, or more than a bit of a shock to my father, who had felt that they had this bond, and now there was an unwanted stepmother coming in between. He was only 14 years old, so emotionally it was very confronting for him. I think that was one of the reasons why Olga's name was not mentioned very prominently in our family stories when I was growing up. Yeah.
And then communism comes into Hungary, so they decide they need to leave.
Yes, but before that, something even more important happened. Over in New York, Olga's uncle, Gabriel Wells, had been ailing during the war, and he died. He died after my grandfather Polly had married his niece, just so nobody thinks that he was married her for her money. And then when her uncle died, he had a very large estate, and it was divided up between his nephews and nieces and also a sister. In fact, Olga was not supposed to receive anything. It was supposed to go to her elder sister, Margaret, but she had died in a concentration camp. And so the lawyers had a long time trying to trace Olga. They found her, and she received a modest inheritance, but it was enough to make them not penniless refugees, but people with just a little bit behind them. So that helped my grandfather with the delicatessen in Jernjish. But then in the late 40s, the communists took over. And so for the second time, he lost his delicatessen, and they could see the writing on the wall, and they decided it was time to leave.
And so they were casting around to find a place to go, and they thought America at first, and Ivan got into university at Rutgers, which there was this kind of implication that may have had something to do with Gabriel Wells being a benefactor of Rutgers, but...
yes, I mean, it may be a coincidence, but Gabriel Wells had given money to Rutgers, and then Rutgers took in my father.
But they didn't allow Olga and
Polly, no, and so he didn't want to be separated from them again, so they decided not to go to America, and they cast around for other countries, and they heard that Australia was taking Jewish refugees. And
first of all, they went to Austria separately, though. They had to make that sort of escape over the mountains.
Yes, my father escaped separately, which I always thought was a measure of his discomfort with his stepmother, but it was put to me by historians that perhaps it was easier for one to get away than for 3 to get away together. And that was a very exciting period for my father, because he had learnt the accordion and the piano when he was a child. And so he got his health and fitness back, and then he also formed a band, which he led, a jazz band, 6 or 7 piece ensemble, which was a very happy time for him in Austria.
Well, he started in Salzburg playing in a band until they decided they didn't like the tattoo on his arm, and
yes,
he had to go.
So he was quite shocked by that, because as nearly all the inmates of Auschwitz he had a tattoo on his arm, but when he would go and apply for jobs in Austria, he didn't know why he wasn't getting them. And people were saying, look, they see the tattoo, they feel a bit uncomfortable and a bit guilty, and they don't want to be reminded of it. And so he was advised to go and have it cut out because that would help him get work. And he went to a doctor who was cutting out tattoos and other bits and pieces from SS officers who was making a good living doing that after the war. He took the tattoo out for my father, and then lo and behold, he started getting work again. Yeah.
So went to Vienna, but eventually, and then the parents joined him, if I remember correctly.
That's right. They escaped separately. They met up again in Vienna, and from there they made their way to Genoa and took a ship over to Melbourne first, and then up to Sydney in 1952.
And because of the inheritance from Gabriel Wells, whose original name was Gabor Weiss, so another name change in the Anglicisation, is that the word?
Yes.
And so, I just find that interesting as well, how our identities change as we have to adapt in new places and enculturate, I guess.
Yeah. Just on that note, his name was Weiss, my family's name is Weizmann. And when I was giving a talk in New York at the public library, at the end of the talk, they said, are there any questions? And one woman piped up and said, have you taken a DNA test? Because I think you look like Gabriel Wells. And also, because your name was Weizmann and his is Weiss, you must be related. This is just... So, not all the questions were at that level.
That would be unfortunate.
Yes, yeah.
So they arrive in Sydney. What was that like for them because your father was by this stage in his early 20s?
Yes. Yeah, so he was 23 and he was a very robust, healthy man. His father, Polly, was in his mid-50s and he didn't really know how to do anything except sell small goods. And it was a bit late for an old dog to learn new tricks. So he returned to what he knew best, and they used the inheritance from Olga to buy a business in King's Cross and start a delicatessen, which they called the Minerva Delicatessen, which was in honour of the Minerva Theatre, which was a landmark theatre which was around the corner. So it was a fantastic business decision because, as Asians say, location, location, location. Everything was happening in King's Cross. Just to give you an example, around the corner was the Roosevelt Club, which was owned by Abe Saffron. So I don't know if Abe is big in Melbourne, but he was huge in Sydney. Mr. Sin, he ran all of the underworld crime out of that nightclub. So there'd be dancers and singers, and then he'd be dealing in drugs and bootleg booze and prostitution out the back. Around the corner, and 2 shops up from the Minerva Delicatessen, was something called the Kashmir Cafe. And that was quite infamous because that was the favoured haunt of a woman called Rosaline Norton. Anybody know who Rosaline Norton is? She was the White Witch of King's Cross.
This is the chapter Wogs and Witches.
Yes, and so Rosaline actually had her teeth sharpened to look the part and wore a witch's hat. But more than that, she was infamous for holding very sort of kinky sexual covens in her apartment, and she drew pornographic murals on the wall of this cafe, and that got the owner arrested, and so she would be around there all the time. So there were police and there were underworld figures.
Tell us a little bit about her lover, Sir Eugene Gossens.
Yes, so this is a very famous story in Sydney, but one of the early conductors of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra was a man called Eugene Gossens, and be brought out from England, and he was a very upper class fellow, but he had a private secret liking for kinky sex and a bit of pornography, and so he fell under her spell and would go around to her apartment and then also, when she was going out to the cafe, and indulge in these practices, and it became a huge scandal, and he was forced to leave the country in disgrace. So she cast quite a spell on people. And then up the other end of the street from the delicatessen was a beautiful old Art Deco apartment block. So they have a lot of lovely apartment blocks in King's Cross, which were modelled on the Upper East Side of New York. And in one of these, ASIO cast a sting with a Soviet diplomat called Petrov. you may have heard of. So they worked out that Petrov liked wine and women, not necessarily in that order. They would lure him up to a room with a woman of the night, get him drunk, get him excited, and then she would be tasked with asking him about his job. And next door was Asio listening to him. And so that was only 50 metres up the road the other way. So there was no shortage of very exciting activity. And of course, at that time, King's Cross was one of the few places in Sydney where you could eat proper continental food. So Sydney was a culinary desert in the early 50s. But in King's Cross, you had the Hungarians, the Viennese, the French, the Czech, the Greek, the Italian, with their food and their clothes. It was very European and continental. So it was a wonderful place for them to set up the delicatessen.
But not long after they arrived and got established, Olga passed away.
Yes.
Suddenly.
Again, this was another reason why Olga was invisible. She died from a stroke. She'd been in good health within 18 months of them arriving. And she had died so suddenly that she hadn't left a will. Now, under New South Wales law, her estate went to her husband, Polly, and so he had used that money to invest in the business, and he'd also used it to buy a house. But then they got a shock. They got a legal challenge, and this was the document that I found in the strongbox at the beginning of our talk today. And this had come from her cousins, who she had been in constant contact with, and they had sent a letter of demand saying that, look, during the war and shortly afterwards, we sent you an ounce of money for pantyhose, for food, for cigarettes, for odds and sods to help you get by. And they had made, I'd found in my research, a catalogue of all of the items that they had sent her money for, added them up, and said, we want that money back. So it was incredibly mean-spirited.
Unbelievable, because they were well established.
They were very comfortable. It wouldn't have made any difference to them at all.
Yeah.
So they sent this letter of demand to my grandfather, Polly, and he was in a bind because he had used the inheritance to buy the business, used it to invest in the house. He was averse to conflict. He didn't want to risk going to court and losing and having to pay costs. So reluctantly, he agreed to pay back half of the inheritance that they had received. And this set him and my father back 5 years. So my father said later on that they had to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, just to get back to where they'd been 5 years earlier.
And so another coincidence, they're in the shop and in walks a young woman. Well, she's no longer a young woman, but someone who had heard about this Hungarian father and son, and she was from Hungary.
Yes.
And she had survived and come to Australia and ended up becoming Ivan's third stepmother.
No, yes. So
stepmother.
This was one of, I guess, Olga's ongoing gifts to my family, was that even though she had passed away, the shop had come from the inheritance, and the shop became the centre of our family's existence. So, as Debbie said, one day a middle-aged Hungarian woman came in and said that she had heard that one of the Weitzman brothers was around, and she said, do you know anything about them? And my father said, well, I'm one of the Weitzman brothers, because he was one of 7 brothers. And this woman, Roji, was very outspoken, very candid, and said, well, you're not the handsome guy I remember from when I was a young girl. Because she said that she had been the girlfriend of Polly, but she didn't recognise him, and he didn't recognise her. And after thinking for a couple of minutes, he hid his hand on his head and he said, I don't remember you. I don't remember your face, but I think you had a really beautiful swimming costume. And then he said, look, you're no beauty yourself.
That's the name of that chapter.
Yeah.
Chapters had fabulous
and from that exchange, a romance was born. And within a year, they were engaged and married. So my grandfather didn't like to muck around. He married quickly. He married Olga within a year, and then he married Roshi within a year. And then a year afterwards, another middle-aged Hungarian woman came in. And she didn't have eyes for Polly. She had eyes for Ivan, because she had a beautiful daughter who was unmarried and didn't have a boyfriend at the time. She saw my father, who at that time still had a lot of hair. He had a twinkle in his eye. He spoke good English. Nice family business. My father agreed to go out with his daughter, and he was very taken with her. And so much so that when they went out for their first proper meal, there was a very famous restaurant up in King's Cross called the Chelsea. Which, I don't know, some of you may have heard of it. And my father spent the whole week's wages on that meal with my mother. And it worked a treat. And then within a year, they were engaged and then married. So everything important in our family happened in that delicatessen.
That chapter's when Ivan met Eva.
That's right.
And then, so they set up home in Camaret over on the north side, which is, I grew up in Kalara, which is way north. So I know that divide between north and south, but that's where you were born and your brother.
Yeah, that's
on the
right.
North Shore.
So we grew up in the North Shore, and I'm sure some of you have been to Sydney, but you'll know that, there are people there of my parents' generation who had been through Holocaust, deprivation, starvation, and they'd survived. They were resilient. But it was still too hard to go across the Sydney Harbour Bridge to visit friends on the North Shore. So my father bought a house in Camaret because you could get a lot of value for a house there as opposed to the eastern suburbs. And so they set up there, and Polly and Roshi lived on top of them, which was not uncommon at the time for European parents. But it was a very difficult life for my mother in particular. Her mother-in-law was not an easy woman.
No, and Polly died quite a few years before. I call her Rosie, but you say Georgie because I'm not very good with the phonetics. So she lived to 101. So Ivan and Eva actually had to look after her in her dotage.
Oh, for about 40 years.
Well, she was a difficult woman.
She was a difficult woman, yes. To give you an example, when my brother had his bar mitzvah, the photos came back, and in those days, the photographers would keep the negatives because that's how they made money. So we got the proofs and the original photos, and they were beautiful. And so my mother was so excited, she sent them upstairs for my grandfather, Polly and Roshi, to have a look at. And they came back down a couple of days later. And Roshi didn't like the way she looked in photos, so she had cut herself out of the photos and stuck them back together again. And I think it was the first time that I heard my mother utter a four-letter word.
That's a bit like the letters out of the Gutenberg.
Yes. And that was the least of what she did. At one point she tried to sue my father. So there was not a lot of love lost between them.
Polly spent a lot of time downstairs with Ivan and...
Yes, he'd come down every night, ostensibly to count the day's takings with my father, but really it was to get away.
Get her a prayer.
And also to get some good food downstairs.
Because she was no chef.
She was no chef. She was an artist.
Yeah.
And in later life, she had a little following, a salon of Hungarian Jewish women who would come to her patio upstairs, and they would paint copies of Cézanne and Degas and Monet. And she became quite competent in art later in life.
And obviously had a great number of friends, and she was a colourful personality, but difficult in the family environment. But the other thing that I find so interesting, then we'll go to questions, because I'm sure there'll be some, is this segue to the fact that you lived across the road from, I guess, an Aussie, not Jewish family, the Dixons.
English born, yeah.
Yeah. So Jonathan Dixon was your friend?
Yes.
And tell us about what ended up happening with Jonathan Dixon that brings us back to the rare books and the Nogel Fragments.
Yes, so this is a lovely story. So across the road from us, there was a family of English people, two brothers and a sister. And one of them, Jonathan, went to school with me. He was prodigiously bright, lovely guy. and we would go over and play table football with them. His mother, who was a very generous person, helped my grandmother, Rogie, write her memoir, and it was from that memoir that I had that story about the bathing costume. And so they were very close to us. After school, we lost touch. And I had written some articles about my family before the book, and it had brought me back into contact with Jonathan, who I then discovered had gone and moved to Melbourne and worked for a rare book dealer. Huh. So I thought I would ask him if he'd heard of Gabriel Wells, because I wasn't sure how well known he was. And he said, of course, he's famous. And in fact, the Gutenberg Bible, there are these incredible books about it. And I'm going to put you in touch with an academic and a scholar in America, at Princeton, who is the world's Gutenberg guru. And so it was actually following that up from Jonathan and the scholar in America that I was able to get a lot of information about the Gutenberg Bible that helped me write the book in the first place. So it's been a lovely sort of circle that's come around. First, his mother was very closely involved with my grandmother, Rogie, with her book. And then her son, Jonathan, has been almost the ground zero of helping me start this book. You reminded me of a lovely story in terms of Rogie and her profile amongst the Hungarian and artistic community. At the recent election, I went to vote at our local booth, and so I presented myself, and the woman there asked me my name, and I said Visontay, and she said, Visontay. And I said, yes, yeah, you're Hungarian. And she said, yes. But she couldn't tell me her name because she was working for the Electoral Commission. And she said, you're not related to Rogie Visontay, are you? And I said, look, I'm her grandson. She said, I used to take my parents up to her house to go and paint there.
How incredible.
Yes, and then she said, I've got her book, Boutique. I know about her story. And she said, and I said, well, I've written a book. And she said, have you? I said, yes, it's about the Gutenberg Bible. She said, yes, I may have heard about it on the radio. But look, I've got these lovely photos of my parents with Rogie. Maybe I can come and show them to you. And so I went back and I sort of stalked her the next day to find out who she was, and I gave her a number so that she could contact me. So it's been another way in which the book and the family have sort of just kept giving. Yeah.
This is the amazing thing. So I feel like that's probably a point now that it's 5-4 that we should go to Q&A. But, there are so many stories like this. I know it feels like we've given a lot, but there's huge amounts more. It's a rich book. So do people have questions at all? You were very... Yes? Alex always has a question.
I have lots.
We love you for that.
I have lots of questions. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
It sounds fascinating. I've never heard of the Gutenberg Bible, but it sounds fascinating. What happened to the other leaves? Are they still around? Part one. And second part, you said that the way you got to Mr. Wells was because his name was written in the legal document.
Yes.
I'm confused on the timeline. Hadn't he already died by the time that came out? Why was his name in that document?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. So, yes, he had died, but it was through his estate that his nephews were working and wanting the money back for his estate. And so that's why his name was mentioned. In terms of the other leaves, so the other half of my book is having seen that the breakup of the Bible had given my family a new lease of life. I also wanted to track down what had happened to the leaves of the Bible that had been sold off and dispersed, because in breaking up the Bible, Gabriel Wells had given them a new lease of life. They became objects of value and treasured in their own right. So I spent weeks and months speaking to people all around the world about what had happened to the book of Esther, the book of Revelation, the book of Genesis, the Ten Commandments. And so my book is actually an intertwining of the two stories of how the Bible had helped my family have a new lease of life and what had happened to my family, but also what had happened to the other pages from the Bible. So it's been tremendously rewarding. And when I was in New York, as I mentioned earlier, and met some of these dealers at the book fair, I found out all these stories behind the stories that they were a little bit scared to tell me. So the book just keeps on growing.
So there's part 2 coming.
There's
Part two.
it could well. Can you tell us about? Is it Kalman in California that started the library, the travelling library to the small towns? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't think it was Kalman. I think Kalman was in.
Who's the? He was a billionaire that dressed very poorly, according to the Ron Randall's.
Karpeles.
Oh, sorry,
yes.
got the name wrong.
Yes.
No wonder I confused.
So there's a very interesting man called David Karpeles, who I'd never heard of, and he has the largest private collection of documents in the United States. Millions and millions of documents. And he'd started off as a mathematician working for an electronics company, and then he'd come back to his hometown of Santa Barbara, where he made a fortune in real estate. And he came up with this idea of having museums that were small museums in famous buildings, that he would get copies of famous documents and make exhibitions of the copies in the small museums, in the small buildings. And he had about 10 or 12 scattered around America, because originally he tried to have an exhibition in New York with the original documents, and it was the same time as something that was happening in the Museum of Modern Art, and nobody came. He then bought up an old town hall somewhere in New Orleans or Tennessee or Midwest, said that he had a leaf from the Gutenberg Bible or a copy of the Declaration of Independence or Albert Einstein's E equals MC squared. So he really bought up these great documents. And the exhibition would be packed. There'd be 5,000 people and be standing room, and cars would be lined up, for blocks. Mm-hmm. So a very unusual way of creating exhibitions and museums. And I discovered that he had bought one of the 10 Commandments, one of the pages with the 10 Commandments. There were two, as I'm sure everybody knows here, one in the book of Exodus and one in the book of Deuteronomy. But the problem was that this man, David Karpeles, had died the year before I started doing my research.
Oh, yeah.
And I got in touch with his son and his daughter, and they were too busy because their mother had dementia. Nobody knew anything about the sort of details of what they had. And so I had to ring up the receptionist at the exhibition museum in Santa Barbara and ask her to send me photos over of the leaves and their descriptions of them. But I could never tell whether he had 2 pages with the 10 Commandments, so he had 20 commandments, or whether he had 10 commandments but doubled up in his reference library because nobody had taken sufficient care. And that took me months and months and months to find out that I didn't know the answer. Ironically, when I went to the Rare Book Fair, I was introduced to a man who had been brought in to be a consultant to the Karpeles collection, and he said, "Oh, is that all you want to know? I've got a list of everything they've got." So that was a lovely sort of sense of closure there. And again, that goes, Alex, to the next part of the book, where I can just sort of update a lot of the information that I've got through people coming out of the woodwork.
It just does not stop. Are there any other questions through that?
Yes.
So a lot of these pages, which may have originally been held in private hands, have worked their way into public institutions. However, there is one that you talk about which is still in the private hands, and I'm thinking about the one that made its way to the Ukraine, in which these pages are not considered important literary works or evidence of civilization, but they become a currency in themselves in the way that people use gold if they want to transfer wealth.
Yeah. So there, about 10 years ago, there was a newspaper report about a Ukrainian politician called Viktor Medvedevchuk. Now, Medvedevchuk was Putin's man in the Ukraine, and he was quite a controversial figure. In fact, Putin was the godfather to his daughter. Now, at that time, the Ukrainian government decided to ask its parliamentarians to do an audit of all of their private assets to make sure that there was no conflict of interest, which sounds like a joke compared to what's happening today. Anyway, Medvedevchuk came out and announced that he had acquired a noble fragment, a leaf from the Gutenberg Bible, but refused to say anything more. So when the journalists and scholars have said, where did you get it? How much did you pay? What was the background to it? He just waved them off and scoffed and said, well, I'm not going to be bothered with this. I bought the noble fragment for the glory of Ukraine, and I'm absolutely insulted that you are questioning my motives. And before they could find out any more about it, the war started. Russia invaded Ukraine, and Medvedevchuk was arrested because he was considered to be a fifth column, a Putin man in Ukraine. And so they confiscated his assets, which included 36 apartments, 25 cars, a couple of yachts, but they didn't find the noble fragment. And they never got a chance to, because there was a prisoner swap between Russia and the Ukraine, and Medvedevchuk was the leading prisoner. He was the trophy prisoner. He went back to Russia. Putin took him under his wing. He's now writing propaganda for Putin. And you may remember at one stage that Putin had called for Zelensky to be thrown out, and that he wanted to install his own person there, and it probably would have been this man Medvedevchuk. So he's gone, and his noble fragment has gone with him. Scholars are still trying to find out what happened to it, but until Ukraine can perhaps get the upper hand against Russia, which is wishful thinking, we'll never know what happened to it. But it's an example of how these leaves have been flung to all corners of the globe. Ironically, the reason I got a hold of that leaf and that story was because I had been researching who the previous owner was through some dealers, and I heard that 10 or 15 years earlier it had belonged to a Christian collector in Indianapolis in America. And there was a great story about how he started collecting noble fragments. He, I know I'm going over here, but at the end of communism, with the downfall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, this Christian collector, who was the son of a Christian pastor, was sitting in what was known as the world's largest cafeteria in Indianapolis, listening to a gospel concert. And in the middle of the concert, a man came out. He was the head of the World Bible Society, and he said, look, the Berlin Wall's coming down. Russia has been a godless country for many, many years. This is our opportunity to reacquaint them with the ways of Jesus and the gospel. And so I have copies of the King George Bible here, and if you will pay me $500, we will give you a leaf of the Bible, and that $500 will go to sending Bibles off to Russia. And so this collector did so, and then that was the beginning of a lifelong pursuit of collecting Bibles. And so he bought and sold 20 of the noble fragments from the Gutenberg Bible over his life. And we became very good friends. And so there was a whole story about how the head of the World Bible Society had sort of prompted him to then become one of the world's great collectors of Gutenberg Bible leaves. When I was in New York and talking at the New York Public Library, at the end of the talk, a woman came up to me and said that she was a scholar at the City University. And did I know anything about the head of the World Bible Society, because she'd read the book? And I said, oh, look, I knew a little bit about him. And she said, well, I've been doing research into him, and he's a complete crook.
Why are we not surprised?
And so the Bibles didn't really make their way over to Russia. And he had a scam where he would get people to buy up Bibles. He would cut pages out of them, get them valued for more than they were worth. And then he would take the money that was paid into the charity, allowing the collectors to write off that money as a donation from their tax. He was a complete crook. So the more that I talked, the more that I learned about some of the nefarious practices of these people.
All I can say is I can't wait for volume 2.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Debbie.
you,
Thank you
Mike.
very much for coming.